1 Corinthians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul says, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, but I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. Today, I am with you in weakness. I'm coming off of 2 weeks of recovery from pneumonia. My wife, even as I was leaving yesterday morning to come here, said, is it Little Rock or Kaiser? And so it's been a rough recovery, and this morning was pretty rough as well. I came in late this morning. I was planning to be here at 8. I know especially this ministry, things need to be punctual, and time can communicate things to people. Coming in late can communicate that you don't value the meeting. To let you know how much I value the meeting, today is my birthday. This is very important to me. So I want to thank you. Thank you very much. That's right. Somebody got that hint, right? Just kind of lobbed it off. Thank you very much. David, I want to thank you for having me. And Dan, thank you so much for organizing this, allowing me to be here. Scott, thank you for the devotion. Where's Scott? Okay, thank you for the devotion this morning. Good reminder there about humility. And I also appreciated your update, Mark. Where's Mark gone now? There you are. I was a contractor for years as well, and just know how much facilities contribute or detract from what we're trying to do. So I really appreciated what you had to share this morning. What we're going to talk about is something that's very close to my heart, and I want to start by talking about the motivation behind me being involved in this work and why I would want to engage with you around it. The issue of diversity and inclusion can be, you can engage in it for a lot of reasons. And it can be also a flashpoint for people, something that can create a lot of division, create a lot of disagreement. And when you look at the history of the United States, it's just, we're one country. This is an issue that goes back to the beginning of time. But in the United States, the issue of diversity and inclusion, it came in a context of racial division in our country that the country was founded on. It was built around that. And as we began to reckon with that, the first motivation for organizations really moving into diversity and inclusion was coercion. The government made some decisions that certain things are going to come to an end, and we are going to come together, and it is not optional. And so because of that motivation of coercion, people developed certain methods of doing this. And the methods were they were forced. They were really kind of geared around compliance, making sure that we stay out of trouble. Organizations didn't want to get sued, or they didn't want the government cracking down on them. So they developed certain methods of doing that. And you still have this legacy of compliance departments in organizations saying, are we doing enough here to just not run afoul of the law? Or is there some way we can circumvent this? I know with the school system, with forced integration of schools, people began to start private schools just to avoid the integration of schools. So there's a lot of ugly history around this. And by the time I really got into it, though, the motivation, by and large, had shifted. I first began studying intercultural competence, which is what we're looking at today, and how we adapt to people of other cultures, to be a missionary. I went to Biola University, and at Biola, I saw this poster on the wall showing 9 guys carrying a log, and 1 guy's on one side, 9 on the other. And it said, if you wanted to help out, which side of the log would you get on? And it said, 9 out of 10 Christians in North America will stay in North America. And so I said, okay, I'll be a missionary. Seemed like just perfect logic, right? So I began studying intercultural competence in order to share the gospel with people of other cultures, and became really fascinated with the Apostle Paul, because that was his driving motivation, to reach as many people as possible. But then the more I began looking at that as a motivation, I said, well, who are the people that are the hardest to reach? Who are the people that are the least reached? And I found that there was another poster on a wall somewhere that said, do you want to be 1 in a million? There's 1 missionary for every 1 million Muslims in the world. And it was a conversation about the 1040 window at that time. So I said, okay, I'll study Islam. I took 5 classes on Islam and began studying how do I reach people in the Middle East, how do I reach people in North Africa and other parts of the world who are steeped in Islam. So my motivation was all around that. But then the more I started looking at Muslim countries, I realized they're closed. It's hard to get into Muslim countries, especially with a missionary visa. So rather than going, and getting a seminary degree and getting a missionary visa, I talked to a guy, and it was a weird relationship. I met a guy who was a consultant to the Saudi royal family. And in talking with him, he said, look, you're going to need to be invited in some way. You need to have some marketable skill. You need a language, Long story short, after several missions trips, one extended 6-month trip to a Muslim country, I ended up going to business school to get an MBA. And I first got a master's in intercultural studies and then got an MBA. And while I was in business school, I came across the second motivation for engaging in issues of diversity and inclusion: money, profit, market share. By the time I was in business school, people were no longer talking about issues of compliance. They weren't talking so much about how do we make sure HR is doing this right so that we don't have legal problems. They were talking about what they called at the time Workforce 2000, the shifting demographic in the United States that meant that the workforce would be so diverse. If you wanted to attract, retain the brightest and the best to be the most effective, you're going to have to create an environment where you can attract people from all different backgrounds, because the workforce is going to be that diverse. There was so much strategy around that, so much conversation around that. And it really showed me how effective people can be when money is their motivation. I thought I was going to put all this mission stuff on the shelf. And I was sitting in a class with a representative of Coca-Cola who was talking about their mission of getting a can of Coke within the reach of every human being on planet Earth. And they started explaining how they were going about this, their strategy. And I perked up because I remembered being out in the desert in West Africa, sleeping in mud huts, and watching donkeys walk by with knapsacks over their backs filled with bottles of Coca-Cola. And I said, man, they are getting it done. They are pushing sugar water all over the world and adapting to cultures in order to get it done, adapting their workforce in order to hire people who can make them more effective, teaching their people how to play well together so that they can make money, so that they can gain market share. We have a much higher motivation. We have a much higher calling. When somebody asked Jesus what is the greatest commandment, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. But he understood the reason the guy was asking his question. And so he says, the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. The lawyer says, who's my neighbor? His goal is to try to narrow down his responsibility. Can I limit who I have to love? Is the question that he's asking. And Jesus, in reply to that, tells a story that flips this guy's paradigm upside down. How many of you like Westerns? Somebody, who was it came with a Bullwinkle reference? That was reaching, man. But I got to tell you, I still remembered it, and I'm glad that you actually, sang the jingle so I wouldn't have to, but yeah. But anyway, I really love Westerns. One thing about Westerns I love is that you can always tell the good guys from the bad guys. Good guys are wearing the white hats, bad guys are wearing the black hats. Sometimes they have a mustache, what happened there? Anyway, but it's great when you have this projection of who the good guys and bad guys are, right? Rabbinic stories were like that. In a rabbinic story, if you're looking for the hero, it's going to be a Levite, it's going to be a priest. If you're looking for the villain, probably a Samaritan. The most despised people as far as the Jews were concerned. So Jesus tells a story about a person who gets mugged, a person who gets beaten, and a Levite walks by and a priest walks by, and along comes a Samaritan, stops his schedule, cares for the person, uses his own medicine, checks him into an inn, pays the existing bills, and says, I'll come back and I'll pay anything else. And then he's like, well, which one of these guys is a neighbor? You go do likewise. First of all, Jesus doesn't answer him directly because Jesus is a Middle Easterner. And so they tell stories. They answer questions indirectly. Did you notice that about Jesus? You ask him a direct question, he's like, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you another story. Here's a third story about the exact same thing. That's how he talks. He often talks in circles that way. Very Middle Eastern way of speaking. But Jesus says, in order to fulfill the second commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, how about if you think of that first and foremost as crossing culture? Loving the person you're trying to avoid to love. This is how he defines it, redefines it for this lawyer who's actually trying to narrow it. Jesus says, no, let me expand it into the area that you intentionally don't want me to go. Part of our motivation is loving our neighbor, obeying that second commandment. It's a higher motivation than anything the world can bring up. Even though there are people who are motivated to engage in intercultural work and diversity and inclusion work, really out of some noble concerns, feeling that human beings have value, all human beings have value, and that's why they want to do it. Our motivation is still higher because we're answering to our Creator. And most people that I find in the Christian space who talk about this, talk primarily about this motivation of loving our neighbor. But the motivation that's driving me, the one that I think actually is most critical when it comes to Cru, and when it comes to family life as part of the Cru family, is evangelism. It's the sharing of the gospel. I love apologetics. I studied it in depth. I studied other religions. I know how to argue and prove a religion to be false. I know how to prove the resurrection happened and the Bible is true and all of that. I find it's usually useless in conversation. But I love that stuff, right? Well, I lost my train of thought with that one. But what I find, though, in sharing the gospel is often the relationship is what really drives it. And Jesus said, I pray that they'll be one, as we are one, Father, so that the world will know that you have sent me. I've seen what that means, that the oneness creates an awareness that the Father sent the Son. I want to show you some slides here. How do we get this going? And I'm panting a little bit because I'm out of breath. I have got one lung really working at full capacity here. Oh, look at that. Okay. So this is the organization that I am a part of. I started Culture Consultants in 2008. I was pastoring a church at that point, and a lot of the people at my church were asking cross-cultural questions, and they were asking kind of executive coaching questions. And I finally said, you're not asking me for pastoral care. Let's be honest here. I need to draw a circle around what I'm doing and just call it what it is. I also had gotten tired of spending so much time with Christians, and I wanted to get back out into the business world. So started this company back then, and have worked in United Arab Emirates, in Indonesia, other parts of Asia, U.S. clients, multinationals, everything from the auto industry to banking, around these issues of diversity, okay? And not so much, that's actually not the best term, it's more like intercultural competence. How do we break into new markets? How do we get people in different countries to work well together? How do we avoid escalating conflicts when people have different rules of engagement around conflict, different cultural rules? And so it's been a wonderful journey, but most recently, I've been getting asked to do this by Christian organizations. And so, as we'll see, we actually, not only do we have a higher motivation, we actually have a lot more resources at our disposal because God talks about this constantly in the Bible. So this is part of my life. Here is the bigger part of my life. This is my wife, Grace, my daughter, Harper. Okay, I could just, don't want to linger on that slide too much, or I'll start getting sentimental. Oh, look, there they are again. Okay, anyway. This is the church that I pastor. It's called New Song, LA. We asked people on the way out of church one Sunday, can you just stand up against that wall? And we should start taking pictures. And what you may notice about this group, there is no ethnic majority at our church. It's people of all different backgrounds. The very first baptism we did, we had a young woman from the Ukraine, we had a guy from El Salvador, a guy from South Korea, African-American guy with dreadlocks down the middle of his back. These were the first 4 people who said they wanted to be baptized. I have the privilege of leading this congregation. We have a motto at our church, back to God and back together, that our whole focus is on reconciliation to God and to one another. And I can tell you, we offend each other all the time. When you bring people together from different backgrounds, you're going to step on each other's toes. You're going to inadvertently, offend somebody. It happens all the time. And so our other motto is, if we can apologize well and forgive well and explain ourselves well, we can live together. And so we have a great time. It allows me on a daily basis to deal with this stuff in a real world context. We have had things escalate to the point of almost church splits, and get to the root of it and find that it's just a cross-cultural misunderstanding. So fantastic opportunity. Not every setting allows for a congregation like this. I live in Los Angeles, okay? A lot of different kinds of people there. Some people write books about how you can have a congregation like this, and they fail to mention that they happen to live in a very metropolitan area with people from all over the world. And then you get pastors frustrated in monocultural neighborhoods saying, wow, why can't I do that? Okay, so anyway, just keeping it real. Okay, here's an example of the highest motivation that we have. This should be familiar to you. 1 Corinthians 9. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. The Apostle Paul said that he was willing to change himself. He was willing to adapt himself to other people in order to win them. His motivation was evangelistic. His motivation was to spread the gospel, to expand the kingdom of God, to bring people into relationship with God. And he would be willing to transform himself in order to do that. Now, the intention of doing that is great. The skill is another matter altogether. How do you know what to change? How do you know when to change? And what setting? And how do you change yourself without actually losing yourself? Even in his description, he's making it clear, look, I know who I am. I know I'm under the law of Christ, and I know that I'm not under the law, the Old Testament law. It's because he knew who he was, because his identity was so rooted that he knew what was adaptable and what was not. And he knew exactly how to adjust himself to another person's culture to make that other person feel included, welcomed, understood, without violating himself in the process. Some people learn this by life experience. Some people know it even as an unconscious competence. It's something they can do, and they don't even realize that they can do it. And they don't even know how they do it. I'll give you an example. I ran a club, a Youth for Christ club, in Compton, California. And it's a predominantly black community, at least it was at that time. Actually, it's more Latino now. And I had these young African-American kids come to the dorms at Biola, and they would hang out, and we'd give them field trips and things like that. And my roommates at the time, one guy was Chinese, another guy was Italian. After the kids had left, they said to me, Adam, when your kids are here, we can't understand a word you're saying. I said, what are you talking about? He said, your voice changes. The words you use, man, we can't understand you. We don't know what you're talking about when they're here. And I had no idea that I spoke any different when these kids were around than when I'm hanging out with my roommates in college on a regular basis. Another example, I was speaking at a seminary for Spanish speakers. And I was speaking with a friend of mine who does simultaneous translation. So you don't have to slow down at all. I mean, this guy just translates on the fly. So I was just going full bore preaching You know, I was in my preacher mode going, and then I got to a point in the notes where I knew some Spanish. So I threw in some Spanish terms, and he translated it into English without missing a beat, and everybody just bursted out laughing. And he had no idea that he had done that, because he adapts so easily, he doesn't know when he's doing it. Okay? So some people, through their life experience, develop this competency, but they don't even necessarily know how they do what they do. There was a woman named Ruth Useem back in the 1970s, I believe it was. She was an anthropologist. She was traveling all over the world with her kids, and she noticed that her kids would try to make sense of two worlds, their parents' home world and this new world. And they would develop this ability to adapt. And so she came up with a term, third culture kids. How many of you have heard of that term before? That's where it came from, third culture kids. She studied this idea of being third culture initially as a problem, a common struggle. And so a lot of the focus was on what are the challenges that kids like this face? What are the difficulties? What are their life patterns? But that study over the decades has shifted to what are the advantages of people who have grown up this way? And we are finding that the skills that they develop, we need to intentionally develop. Now, as you go through the Bible, I would challenge you, look for this. Because once I started looking for it, I realized most of the major characters in the scripture are third culture people. And it's by God's intention, not theirs. First assignment, Abraham, I'm going to bless you, bless all those who bless you, curse all those who curse you, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. First assignment, go and be an immigrant. Because that's how you become who I need you to be in order to do what I need you to do. And with each successive generation, you see it intensify. Joseph is actually sold into slavery, so he becomes so Egyptian that his brothers can't even recognize him. The Egyptians still look at him as a Hebrew. They won't even eat with him. But his brothers look at him as Egyptian. He marries an Egyptian priestess, so his children are half Egyptian, half Hebrew, but they are culturally Egyptian. They are actually raised by a mom who is an Egyptian priestess. Fast forward to Moses. You get the story, right? You see the pattern happening here. Look at the passages in the Bible with women's names. Ruth, Esther, what do they have in common? Both of them, women who are in cross-cultural marriages in cross-cultural settings. Trace this through the Bible. I could do it with you right now, but then we wouldn't get the rest of our presentation. But I found that this is something God is doing intentionally throughout the scripture. And it's not until we get to the Apostle Paul that we hear someone articulate their own intentionality to say, I will not make God force me to do this. I will not require God to put me in situations where I have no choice. I will intentionally do this because I get what God is trying to accomplish. Does that make sense? And when you look at how Paul boasts, he says, you know, I worked harder than the rest of those apostles. I mean, he's really a funny guy. I love the Apostle Paul. But what he's saying is, I had a deeper reach than they did because I was willing to train harder, because I was willing to work harder to become what I needed to become, to be used in a broader way than they could be used. We have a choice. I mean, we can limit our scope, or we can intentionally say, this ministry is meant to have a great scope. And if that's the case, it means we have to work harder. All right. I'm going to skip some of this stuff and get right into the IDI. Why does the IDI fit into this? Why does it matter? If you make up your mind, like the Apostle Paul, we are going to be people who adapt for the sake of the gospel so that we can reach all kinds of people. We're going to be people who love our neighbor, meaning everyone, and we do that well. We're going to be people who are one, so that the world can look at our oneness, and it is evidence of the truth of the gospel. We're going to be those kind of people. Once you make up your mind to do that, good intentions is not enough. You need skill at that point. Oh, by the way, one other story just to tell you about how this can convince people that the gospel is true. When we planted that church that I showed you there, we were meeting in a recreation center. And there was a guy who ran a kiosk where he sold like ice cream and stuff like that. And he says, hey, what is that? I see you guys coming in here each week. What is this? And we said, it's a church. He says, you have got to be kidding me. That's a church? He said, man, that is the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. You guys are from all over the place, and you seem to love each other so much. It just looks like one big family. He says, look, do you have any flyers? Do you have any cards or anything that I can give out at my kiosk when I'm trying to, sell things? I want to tell people to go to your church. Now, what was interesting is this guy was a Muslim. But he said, as a Muslim, he'd never seen anything like that, and he wanted to promote the church. That's what Jesus prayed for. A kind of oneness that the world cannot explain. And once you make up your mind, okay, that's what we want, then how do we go about acquiring the skill? If we can't go back and be born all over again in a family where we have to adapt to cultures from place to place, if we can't redo our childhood or redo our college years and what have you, can we intentionally gain these skills? The IDI is a way of doing that. What the IDI measures is how culturally adaptable are you? How well do you adjust to people who have different cultural perspectives? And this study of culture is being done by a wide variety of people, again, for a wide variety of reasons. In the area of missions, one of the best resources is Ministering Cross-Culturally. It's a very simple book, Ministering Cross-Culturally, by Sherwood Lingenfelter and Marvin Mayers. Both of them were mentors of mine. Dr. Mayers was the dean of the school that I studied under. He was a personal mentor of mine. But he developed a framework of saying, here are some ways in which you can analyze cultural differences. Here are 7 categories you can use. Another guy by the name of Gertz Hofstede studied this in the business context, going back decades, and all of his information is open source, and it's been validated over and over and over again, looking at here ways in which people differ in their perspectives, cultural perspectives. Well, similarly, there was a couple, the Bennetts, both PhDs, and they were looking at, is there a way to measure a person's progress as they become more and more culturally adaptable? And what they found was there's a predictable pattern to this. How a person becomes more culturally adaptable has a pattern. And this is what that pattern looks like. The first level is denial. It's where we don't really see cultural differences and we don't really have much interest in them. I'll give you a funny example of that. I was in West Africa, out in a village, a very remote village. There was a woman who was in her 70s or 80s, I would imagine. In West Africa, there were lots of tribes there, but this particular village was a Bambara tribe. And I knew just enough Bambara to say, I'm learning Bambara. I don't speak Bambara, but I'm learning it. And I had a language helper that could coach me into saying it exactly right. So I had perfect diction, all of that. And I said that to this lady, I don't speak Bambara, but I'm learning it. And she just burst out laughing. And I asked my language helper, why is she laughing? And then she started talking really fast in Bambara. Of course, I didn't understand a word of that. He's translating it into French for me. I'm trying to figure out what is he saying. I knew enough French to get by at the time. And he says, what she said was, all black people speak Bambara. Now I want you to think about that. All black people speak Bambara. As far as she was concerned, that was true. She had never met a black person who didn't speak Bambara. She's living out in a remote village in Mali, and I come along, I'm the first black person she's ever met that doesn't speak her language. So for her, she's at the level of denial. There's what cultural difference, what is that? It's not something I'm interested in. It's not something I even know exists or care about. The next is the Bennett's described as defense. We're going to show in a moment that there's a better definition for this. But this is where we begin to recognize differences, and that's a problem. It's us and them thinking. It's like, wow, those people really are different. And what does that mean? And so which one of us is better? That's kind of how we think about it. Which one is safe? Which one is dangerous? Which one is good? Which one is bad? That's the first level when you begin to engage cultural differences. The next one is minimization, where we say, actually, underneath it all, we're all the same. I remember speaking at a place, I think it was rural Nebraska, and not a lot of black people in this particular area. I was looking around, I saw the cover of the Bibles were black, but other than that, it was just me, right? So this guy comes up to me after my message, and he says, when I look at you, I don't see a black man, I just see a man. And, I was tempted to say, let me loan these to you. But I understood what he meant. What he meant was, you surprised me because you just seem like a normal person to me, somebody that I can learn from, and that isn't what I expected. That's what he was saying, right? So what he was saying was very positive. It was very good, even though it sounded strange to me. That's minimization. Minimization is where you start to say, you know what? We're all the same. We're actually all human beings. It's a beautiful stage of development. The next stage is, these are all, I should point out, these are all ethnocentric stages. What that means is, at each of these three stages, you're still seeing the world through one cultural lens, through your own. And you're valuing everything from your own perspective, not looking at it from multiple perspectives. But each stage is progress. The next one is called acceptance. That's when you begin to realize, oh, yeah, we're all the same, but we're also different at very deep levels. And these differences are not matters of one being better, one being worse. They're just different. There's actually not even a moral judgment here. It's just a different way of viewing the world, a different software that a person is operating with. That's a deeper level of understanding. The Apostle Paul exhibited this kind of understanding. If you remember him in Acts chapter 17, if you begin at the beginning of Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul had a standard method of preaching the gospel. He would go through the Torah in the synagogue 3 consecutive Sabbath days and explain to them the Christ had to suffer, Jesus is the Christ. That was his method. He tried that in Athens, in the marketplace, with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers around, and they said, what is this babbler talking about? But they give him a second shot, and his second shot at it, he never once quotes the Torah. Instead, he references their history, their religious history, in which they engaged a God whose name they did not know. And they've experienced deliverance from this God, even though they didn't know his name. He references their poets. He quotes their poets without being able to Google it. He quotes 2 poems, both written to Zeus. He lifts a line from each poem that is true, splices them together, and preaches the gospel. I mean, he's the guy. He's the guy. He's got mad skills, okay? But that's an example of someone seeing the world from more than one perspective, understanding that there are deeper cultural differences, and I know what they are. That's the Apostle Paul. He actually exhibited the next level, which is adaptation. Not only do I understand the differences, but I can code shift. I can switch from operating from one cultural perspective to operating from another. That's what he's describing in 1 Corinthians when he says, I'm all things to all people. I know when to practice the law, and I know when to act as if I'm not under law at all. I know how to make a person who's weak feel accepted, and I know how to get a person who's actually very strong and has a very deep understanding of faith to recognize their own freedom. So this is where we're headed, actually, adaptation. Now, the Bennett's initially looked at another stage called integration, but what we find is that integration is something that happens within a person who is from different cultural backgrounds themselves, and it isn't really a developmental stage, but the IDI still measures it in another way. So these last stages we would call ethno-relative stages. That's the ability to see things through more than one cultural perspective. On further analysis, these stages were modified in their description a little bit, but what they are measuring is how we balance these two things, commonality and difference. If we put the wrong emphasis on commonality, we end up with conformity. The wrong emphasis on commonality produces conformity. Everyone has to do things exactly the same way. Now, I can prove to you from Scripture that is not how the Apostle Paul operated. If you look at the book of Galatians, he argues tooth and nail against circumcision. He says, when I went to Jerusalem, I had Titus with me, and I made sure that he did not have to get circumcised. Titus was one of his interns, right? So imagine if you're applying for an internship with the Apostle Paul, and you talk to Titus, hey, what is it like working with the Apostle Paul? What is that like? You know, how can I, what should I expect? He's asking if I want to do this. And Titus probably said, hey, it's great. You know, he took me to Jerusalem. They were trying to get me circumcised. He fought that I didn't have to do that. He's taught me so many things, man, it's great. So you get to Acts 16, and Paul meets this young guy named Timothy, and he brings him along. And Timothy probably asked around, Silas, hey, what's it like? Titus, what's it like? Great. First thing Paul says to Timothy is, you need to lift your tunic. We've got to do some minor surgery here. Why does Paul circumcise Timothy and fight not to circumcise Titus? Because Titus is a Gentile. And to circumcise Titus says Gentiles have to become Jews in order to become Christian. To circumcise Timothy, who is half Jewish and half Greek. His father is Greek, his mother is Jewish. He's never been circumcised, he's now an adult. To circumcise him says, Timothy, you need to embrace your cultural heritage on both sides of your family. And as you do that, you are going to be more effective for the gospel because you'll be able to reach both Jews and Gentiles. I can take you into the temple, Timothy, if you get circumcised. So his motivation is the same. It's the gospel. But his method is different for one person than it is for another. So if we put too much emphasis on commonality, everybody has to have the same rules, everything's going to be the same for every person, you're going to end up with conformity. You will have people who will function just like everybody else, even though deep down culturally they're very different. And you will not be able to reach the mainstream of another culture. You will only be able to reach the people who are willing to become like you in every respect other than what's deep inside of them. If we put too much emphasis on our differences, we end up with fragmentation. You end up with a chariot with 6 horses, and every horse is pulling in a different direction. There's nothing that brings us together. The Apostle Paul is really clear about this. We have a central message of the gospel. It does not change. And in fact, I don't care if it's an angel or another person claiming to be an apostle. If somebody brings you a different gospel, Paul said, may they perish. I mean, I want to put it into a, trying to feel out the audience here. What Paul really said is they can go to hell. And he said it twice. So he's saying there is something that is common. We can't be so fragmented, put so much emphasis on our differences that there's nothing that brings us together. See what I'm saying? So what happens then if we get it right? If we get it right, our commonality gives us focus. And our differences give us innovation. We're able to see things differently because we have these different voices. We're able to come up with different ways of approaching things because there was somebody in the room who saw it differently than everyone else. The group speak doesn't take over when we have enough emphasis and proper emphasis on both commonality and difference. So here's how the IDI helps us with that. These are the stages as we're going from denial, where we have little interest in cultural differences. We move to this stage of what we now call polarization. You may recall the Bennett's initially called it defense. It is now called polarization because what we found is there are 2 forms of it. The first form is defense. It's saying that the other group has all these problems. Stereotypes tend to come out of this stage. So it's uncritical towards one's own cultural background and very critical toward others. You can see the flaws in other cultures when you're at a polarized stage of defense, but you aren't as good at seeing the flaws in your own. But there's another version of this, and I find a lot of this happens a lot with highly motivated Christians. Reversal, where you become overly critical of your own cultural background and not critical enough of other cultures. And you can see the safety in that because what you're doing is saying, well, I don't even know enough about that other culture to know whether they're wrong, but I know we're always wrong. So reversal, right? That is still a polarized way of looking at things, us and them. Who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad. Minimization we described, that's where we begin to see our commonality again. Some people talk about this as a colorblind stage. But then when we move into this cross-cultural perspective, that's acceptance. We know how to talk the talk, but we're not sure about walking the walk. That's Peter when he gets to Antioch. Peter gets to Antioch, he's like, I know there's cultural stuff happening here. I remember the experience with Cornelius. I've been eating with these Gentiles, and that's cool. But my friends are here from Jerusalem, and they're really strict Jews, and I realize I'm going to have to adapt here. Now, do I adapt by telling my friends from Jerusalem here in Antioch in order to make sure that the Gentiles understand that they're accepted, we all eat together? Or do I adapt by saying, I don't want to offend my friends from Jerusalem, so I'm going to just eat with them while they're here? And he gets it wrong. He understood there were deeper cultural differences, but he didn't understand how and when to adapt. He got it wrong so bad that the Apostle Paul publicly humiliated him for the mistake that he made. And he said it was so important because he wasn't acting in accordance with the truth of the gospel. Paul, the guy who said never rebuke an elder, harshly, calls out Peter publicly. And you think about it, Paul didn't have that great of a reputation among the apostles and all that. They thought of him still as a terrorist. He's kind of suspect, right? But he puts all of his credibility on the line over this issue because he said it's a matter of the truth of the gospel. But to Peter's credit, Peter was at the level where he understood that there are differences. He just didn't know exactly how you work that out. Paul, however, was here at adaptation. That's where we are able to shift our cultural perspective. And for an organization, this is critical. If your organization is going to reach the world for Christ, if you're going to reach the entire U.S. population with all of its cultural complexity and diversity, then you want to get to a place where you not only know how you create an environment where everyone thrives, but you know exactly how you did it, you can maintain it, you can even teach other people how to do it. And all of your products and broadcasts and materials are so culturally sensitive that no matter what a person's cultural background is, they all have the same level of rich experience of the ministry that you are doing. Now, I can tell you, that's more than just skill. That's actual staffing. That's who's part of your team. And I think one of your challenges as an organization is the diversity of your team isn't there yet. And diversity is just the first stage. Last thing I'll show you here. You see these terms thrown around a lot. Diversity, inclusion, cultural proficiency. Diversity is just who's in the room. If you look around the room, you'll see this isn't that diverse of a group, right? And as you start listening to each other's backgrounds, you find out there's more similarity than meets the eye. I mean, many have had similar life experiences. It's not just that we look the same, we've had similar life experiences. That means you don't have enough diversity to get you where you want to go. But diversity is stage one. Diversity is just who's in the room. It doesn't mean we get along with one another. It doesn't mean we understand one another. It doesn't mean that the organization has changed so that everyone actually has equal access, equal acceptance, equal participation. That's what we mean when we say inclusion. It's making the mix work for everyone. So first stage, get enough diversity. Get it quickly. Get it aggressively. But get it with help. Because even as you bring in people from different cultural backgrounds, you can accidentally bring in a person who makes things harder. Or you can bring in a person without adequate preparation and they have a miserable experience. So do that even with help. But once you are moving in that direction, you also want to work on this issue of inclusion. Are we a place where everyone has equal understanding, equal access, and equal experience within the organization? That means the organization changes in order to accommodate all these people. And then you get to the stage where you even know how you did that. And you can explain to other people how you did it, and you can maintain it, and you can help other people do it. That's really my dream for you, is that you would get to this level of cultural proficiency where this organization is getting phone calls from other organizations saying, how do we do this? How do we do what you did? That's all I have to share with you today. So.